Have you ever watched a life split open in a room full of music? Have you ever smiled for your daughter while feeling the ground drop out from under you? Some marriages do not end with shouting. They end under reception lights, with white hydrangeas on the table, soft jazz in the air, and the man who once promised to love you, sliding a manila envelope across the linen like a bill. My name is Clara Whitmore. I was 52 that night, a nurse from Providence, Rhode Island, a wife of 23 years, and, until that moment, still pretending I had more time before everything changed. Rebecca's wedding reception had been going for 40 minutes at a hotel in Newport. Candlelight trembled. Silverware touched china. The room smelled like salt, air, and flowers. Across the dance floor, my daughter was laughing with her new husband, her veil crooked, her cheeks still warm from dancing. Then, Daniel came up behind me and placed the envelope in front of my plate. He leaned down and said, "Sign these tonight. My attorney says it works better before the end of the month." His voice was low and controlled. I looked at the envelope, then at him. He was wearing the same navy tie he had worn at our wedding, and that detail hurt more than the papers. "Tonight?" I asked. "At Rebecca's reception?" He straightened his cuff. "It does not have to become a scene. Just step outside with me." Before I answered, his phone lit up beside his hand. I did not need to touch it. I only needed the words on the screen. "Are you done yet?" I looked past him at my daughter, and I heard my mother's voice as clearly as if she were beside me. "You do not owe anyone a performance for their comfort." So I picked up the pen. My hand did not shake. I signed every page while the MC asked the room to raise a glass. Rebecca glanced over, smiled at me, and lifted her champagne flute. She had no idea her father was ending our marriage 3 tables away from the cake. Daniel gathered the papers, said he had work, and left within 20 minutes. My sister Elaine crossed the room and sat beside me. "Clara," she whispered, "what just happened?" I kept my eyes on the dance floor. "He served me divorce papers," I said, "but do not tell Becky, not tonight." Elaine squeezed my hand. I stared at the candles until the room stopped tilting. "If you want to understand why I did not fall apart, you have to go back a few years, to the woman who built my way out before I knew I would need one. If you want to understand why I could sit under those reception lights and sign my name without breaking apart, you have to go back to the years when my life still looked solid from the outside." Daniel and I met in our late 20s. He was finishing his MBA at Boston University, and I was a registered nurse in Providence. We married less than 2 years later, and when Rebecca was born, we moved to Cranston because the schools were good and the streets were quiet. For a long time, I was proud of that life. Daniel built his career in corporate finance. I cut back to part-time while Rebecca was growing up, and told myself that sacrifice was simply what marriage looked like when you were building something together. My mother, Margaret Hale, lived alone in Warwick in the house she and my father had bought in the late 70s. 4 years before the wedding, she was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. She was still sharp and independent, but the diagnosis shook both of us. We started meeting for lunch every other week, and between soup, tea, and small talk, she began talking about her affairs, with a calm that sounded like preparation. Around that same time, Daniel changed in ways that were small enough to deny and obvious enough to keep me awake. He started working later. He took his phone into the bathroom. He mentioned a woman from the office named Sabrina, just often enough for her name to settle in the room. Then one evening I picked up his phone, thinking it was mine, and saw a message that told me everything. A few days later, while hanging up his jacket, I found a Cape Cod hotel receipt from a weekend he had told me he was in New York for meetings. I did not confront him. I sat with it. I counted the house, the joint accounts, the savings, my thinner credit history, my age, and the frightening math of starting over. Then I told my mother. She did not interrupt. She stirred her tea and said quietly, "I have been meaning to talk to you about something anyway." She told me she had planned to leave me the house and her savings through her will, but her attorney had urged her to build more protection than that. So she created an irrevocable living trust, managed by an independent trustee, to keep the house, her savings, and her small investment account separate from anything Daniel could ever reach. Then she looked at me and said, "A woman should have something that stands beside her, even when the room still looks peaceful." I cried at her kitchen table, not because I felt hopeless, but because I finally understood that my mother had seen the storm before I let myself name the clouds. When that happened, I still did not know she was racing time, and I still did not know my marriage was slipping away faster than I was willing to admit. By then, I still believed I had a little more time. The trust was finalized about 2 months before Rebecca's wedding, and for one brief moment, that felt like enough. But my mother's health began to slip faster than any of us had let ourselves expect. At first, it was small things you could almost explain away. Her hand trembled harder when she lifted her teacup. One afternoon, she dropped her keys on the front steps and laughed before I could react, as if humor could keep fear from settling in the air. My sister Elaine and I started taking turns driving her to appointments. The waiting rooms all smelled the same, too cold, too clean, too full of people pretending not to be afraid. My mother never performed bravery, but she carried herself with a steadiness that made the rest of us stand up straighter around her. When she died in early spring, Elaine and I were both there. The hospital room was dim except for that flat morning light that makes everything look fragile. I remember the antiseptic smell, the soft mechanical rhythm of the monitor, the way her hand felt cooler than it should have, and still tightened around mine once before it was over. She had been gone only a few months when Rebecca's wedding arrived. By then, the Warwick house, her savings, her modest investment account, and her retirement funds had already been transferred into the trust while she was still fully able to make those decisions herself. What I could not bring myself to do was sign the last set of documents waiting for me. I postponed that meeting again and again because accepting the trust felt too much like admitting that my mother's final act of care had become real and permanent. Then came the morning of the wedding, and I woke with a feeling I could not explain, something quiet and insistent, like a hand at my back. I drove alone to Patricia Green's office in downtown Providence before I put on my heels for the ceremony. I signed the acceptance papers for the trust administration, the property documents connected to my mother's house, and the financial statements Patricia had laid out for me so neatly on her desk. When I finished, she looked at me and said, "Your mother believed in being prepared before life asked for proof." I carried that sentence with me all day. As I walked out to the parking garage, Daniel called once, then again, then a third time. When I answered, his voice was tight. "Where are you? You don't just disappear on your daughter's wedding day." And for the first time, I did not hear concern. I heard irritation, control, timing. I drove to the church anyway. 3 hours later, I watched Rebecca walk down the aisle. A few hours after that, Daniel slid the envelope across the reception table. If he thought I would panic and follow him outside, he only understood half of me. I did stay quiet. What he did not understand was that my mother had already placed something in my hands before he ever made his move. That was what Daniel never understood. He thought silence meant weakness, when in truth it was the only way I had left to keep my balance. After the wedding, the divorce became real in the ugliest, most ordinary ways. There were attorneys, mediation sessions, financial disclosures, spreadsheets, pension statements, mortgage balances, investment records, and endless emails that arrived with polite subject lines and carried the weight of wrecking balls. Daniel had hired a sharp lawyer, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who still believed the room would tilt in his favor if he stayed calm enough. I had Patricia, and by then, I trusted calm more than charm. Early in the process, his side began circling my mother's estate. Not directly at first, just questions, then more questions, then the kind of language designed to sound reasonable, while reaching for something that had never belonged to him. During one mediation session, we sat across from each other under fluorescent lights that made everybody look tired and older than they were. Daniel leaned forward and said, almost softly, "I gave my whole adult life to this family. You're really going to keep all of it?" I looked at him for a long second and said, "No, I'm keeping what was never yours." Patricia did not raise her voice. She never needed to. She laid it out clearly. My mother's assets had been placed into an irrevocable trust before her death, before the divorce filing, and had never been mixed into our marital accounts or used to support shared debt. There was no basis for him to claim them. His attorney pushed anyway. So there were letters, replies, revised demands, and weeks of back and forth that followed me into the quietest parts of the night. I would sit alone at my kitchen table with the overhead light on, rereading legal language until my eyes burned. Once, close to midnight, my phone lit up and my heart jumped because I thought it might be Rebecca. It was Daniel. 3 words, "This isn't fair." Another night he broke protocol and left me a voicemail nearly 4 minutes long, repeating the word fair so many times it lost all meaning. He talked about what we had built together. I listened to it 4 times, then deleted it. And then, slowly, the pressure stopped. His side backed away from the trust. 14 months after my mother died, the Warwick house sold for more than expected. Patricia reinvested the proceeds through the trust, just as my mother would have wanted. My share of the marital settlement was enough for a down payment on a 2-bedroom condo in Salem, with a distant view of the water on clear mornings. I went back to full-time nursing. Some nights I ate standing at the kitchen counter because setting the table for one felt too honest. Some nights the apartment was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum like another heartbeat. I took off my wedding ring in the bathroom and left it in a drawer for weeks. I was not suddenly rich, and I was not instantly healed, but for the first time in years, I was standing on something that was mine, and the hardest part, I was beginning to learn, was not dividing the life we had built. It was walking into a quiet home and teaching myself not to call it failure. And once I stopped calling that quiet failure, I could finally hear what my life was becoming. Rebecca learned about the divorce 2 weeks after the wedding. Daniel and I sat her down on a Saturday afternoon, and it went about the way you would expect when a daughter has just begun her own marriage and suddenly finds out her parents' has ended. She cried first, then got angry, then scared. She asked why. She asked whether we had tried hard enough. Then, in the voice that hurt me most, she asked if it was somehow her fault for being away so much during college. I answered her as clearly as I knew how. No, this is not yours to carry. Some things break between 2 adults, and no amount of love from their child can either cause it or fix it. A few weeks later, she asked me again, this time in private, whether I was all right. I told her the truth. I told her I was not all right yet, but I thought I was going to be. She cried again, then made us tea, and we sat in her apartment for hours talking about my mother, about grief, about weddings, about endings, and about how strange it is to lose one part of your life while another part is still trying to bloom. What I did not tell her then, and have never told her since, was that her father handed me divorce papers at her reception. My sister knows. Patricia knows. One close friend knows. Rebecca does not. I made that choice deliberately, and I have never regretted it. Some truths do not need to be handed to the people we love, just because we were strong enough to survive them. I think about my mother often now, usually, in the smallest moments. The way she used to pour tea with full attention, as if care itself were a discipline, the way she explained the trust without drama, without bitterness, without ever making it about Daniel alone. To her, protection was not suspicion. It was wisdom. It was a woman deciding she had the right to stand inside something solid. Daniel did help build our household, that is true, but it is also true that he chose betrayal, chose timing, chose the one moment he believed I would stay quiet for everyone else's sake. He was right about the silence. He was wrong about everything that silence contained. 2 years later, the divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning. I work 3 days a week now. My condo balcony is crowded with plants I was once told would look messy. I took one trip to the Maine coast, and another to Charleston, and somewhere between the salt air, the hotel rooms, and eating alone without feeling abandoned, I understood something important. My mother did not leave me a fortune. She left me a foundation. Some mornings I stand at the window with my coffee, watch the light move across the water, and say out loud, "Mom, you were right." She signed her love into my future before I knew I would need saving, and by the time Daniel tried to hand me an ending in an envelope, she had already placed the rest of my life in my hands.